PyQt Advanced, working with layouts. Hello everybody, Ben Finkel here, and in this nugget we're going to take a look at how we can work with the layout objects that PyQt exposes in order to organize our widgets or our controls inside of our window. PyQt offers a number of different really cool layouts, predefined arrangements for your user interfaces. And what I mean by layouts are organizing your widgets into coherent arrangements, right? You got to have your widgets organized on screen so that they make sense to your user. Take a look at even like a very simple form, say a simple user form here, right? You've got, let's count here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 different widgets that I've got to get arranged on that form, and they've got to be lined up in these different rows. I want them lined up vertically in these columns. It's kind of a hassle to do, and if you're doing it by absolute positioning, you're moving each one of those elements one pixel at a time to get them right. Plus, if you decide the whole thing has to move down 20 pixels, you got to go and change all that absolute positioning for each one of those individual elements 9 times. Well, that's no good. As always in programming, if you're doing something highly repetitive and kind of annoying, there's probably a better way to do it. And with PyQt, the better way to do it is with layouts. So some of the different layouts that they have available to you are things like the Q VBox layout, which stands for vertical box layout. And that just lays out the user interface elements vertically, just like so. You've also got your HBox layout, your horizontal box layout, and that lays out your user interface elements horizontally. Those are both very simple ways to get quick lineup of your elements inside of your form. We're also going to take a look at something called the Q grid layout, which is kind of a combination of the two, and that's going to let you get your user interface elements lined up in a nice handy little grid so that you can arrange things on your form in a way that really makes sense to your users. So here's a look at a simple layout in action. And notice what I've done here. I've created 5 buttons to start with, but I haven't given any of them a parent widget. So I haven't indicated what window they belong to. They're just kind of floating out there in the void, belong to nobody at all. Because the next thing I do is I create an instance of Q VBox layout. That's the vertical box layout, like I talked about. And I add each button into that layout with the add widget command, button 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then the last thing I do, this very important command here, is I call the set layout function of the window, of the original top level Q widget. In this case, it's myself because I'm inside this class definition. And what that does is that sets the main primary layout for this window to be the Q VBox layout that I just created. I'm going to go ahead and run this, and you can see how easily it works. So what happens is it builds the form, and it lays out each of those buttons vertically, just like I had hoped. Notice they're all lined up on the left, and they are each inside a separate row. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Some other cool things going on here. Notice that as I resize my form, they stretch out and resize with it. That's kind of nice. And I can't shrink this window down below this point here. Check out one thing I did that I didn't point out. I set the size of my window equal to 10 by 10. Well, this is way taller and way wider than 10 pixels in both directions. And that's because the layout forces it to have this minimum size to fit these objects that I added into the layout. So notice they can't shrink up or squeeze any more than this. To do this without the VBox layout would be really difficult. I'd have to have an event watching the resize of the form and change the size of all my widgets every time I resize the form. None of this would work very well. Here, the Q VBox layout gives me a very simple little piece of code that I can use to tell my widgets and my form how it should behave. A simple small change to the code, if I change this from a VBox layout to an HBox layout, that's a horizontal layout, and rerun, and you can see that it operates completely differently, or at least a little bit differently. Now I've got a horizontal layout for all my controls, and they are lined up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 horizontally across my form. All of the other properties remain the same. I can't shrink this down any smaller than it needs to be to fit this layout box that I've created. Now those two layouts, HBox and VBox, very quickly get me some components lined up horizontally or vertically, which is easy and convenient, but doesn't really handle the myriad of different complex ways that we want to lay out our forms in reality, the real things that we want to do with our user interface widgets. Thankfully, what we can do is combine them in different ways using sublayouts. Take a look at this. What I've done here is I've actually created 10 different widgets. I've got 5 labels and 5 buttons. And the labels I add all to this layout 1 VBox layout right here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But for the buttons, I add them to a second layout, layout 2, and that's another VBox layout. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What I then do is I create a third layout called my main layout. Let me scroll down here, and you can see how this works. I create my main layout as a horizontal, an HBox layout, and I add the layouts using the add layout command here. I add layout 1 and then layout 2. So what I've got is I've got a layout that is my horizontal layout, and I add 2 sub-layouts, which are the 2 VBox layouts, V1, V2. And then when I set my layout for my main window, I set it to this main overall layout, the HBox layout. So what that ought to do is that ought to create 2 vertical boxes lined up horizontally side by side for me. And if we go ahead and give this a run, we can see that's exactly what happens. So now it's got 2 sub-layouts that are the vertical boxes here, surrounded by one main box that is my H layout, my horizontal layout. So I can combine these 2 different boxes to create some really unique lined up forms that are going to make a lot of sense, again, for my users. Now this general mechanism, or this general method of laying things out in a grid with items broken up into rows and columns is going to be a pretty popular layout if you think about it. It makes a lot of sense, and if you go ahead and look at any form or any program that you're used to working with, you'll see that things are frequently laid out in this fashion. It makes a lot of sense for users. So with that in mind, PyQt actually exposes a couple of different shortcut layouts, let's call them, for working with grids specifically. And the first one we'll look at is actually called the QGrid layout. And here I've gone ahead and brought up an example of using the grid layout to lay out your items or your widgets inside of a grid format. So to begin with, I just create all my widgets that I want to use. These are my different labels as well as my input boxes for the form that I'm building. And then down below, I create a new QGrid layout. I call the add widget function over and over, but I don't just pass in the widget. I also pass in 2 numbers, the X and Y coordinates of the cell inside of the grid that I want this widget added into. And just like absolute positioning, you can imagine that the grid is a 0, 0 origin in the upper left and an X, Y origin in the lower right. The numbers increase as you move to the right and you move down. So this first line here adds label 1 to cell 0, 0. That's going to be the cell right up here. The next one adds label 2 to cell 1, 0. Well, cell 1, 0 is going to be right below it. Cell 2, 0 right below that, and so on and so forth. You don't set the dimensions of a QGrid layout ahead of time. They are dynamically created when you add widgets to different positions. Let's go ahead and take a look at how this works. Oops, forgot my space. So there you see it. I've got my items lined up in a nice little grid. In this case, a 2-column grid because that's all that I created. But you can see how as I expand and change the size of my form, things expand appropriately. They're laid out very intelligently. And once again, I didn't have to do a lot of work to describe this behavior. It's just baked into that QGrid layout function. And QGrid layout has some neat functions that allow me to span columns or span rows with different elements. So they can have widgets take up more than just one cell. They can take up multiple cells in either direction. And it allows me at a very high level to create whatever kind of layout or form that I need that still conforms to a nice grid-like structure. The last layout I'm going to show you actually simplifies this process even further. You'll notice that this sort of 2-column grid that I've used a whole bunch of times here in this nugget, that's a pretty common layout. We call that a form a lot of times. And so they've created a Q form layout that makes it really simple to lay out forms inside of your user interface. So here you can see I'm using that, and notice how much shorter my code has gotten. I've actually gotten rid of the label widgets. I'm no longer creating the label widgets because I create a new Q form layout, and then I call this add row function, and I pass in my labels as the first parameter on each row. This goes ahead and creates those label widgets for me and does all the lining up and everything that I need it to do. So it's once again just really easy and simple to create a common typical layout. Let's take a look at it. Just come over here and Python layouts4.py. And there it is. So you can see it created a nice lined up form for me with my labels and my text boxes, or my input boxes, lined up appropriately. And it also conforms to the general operating system standards. So for Macintosh, you can see that this form remains centered with the labels right justified and the input boxes left justified on the grid. Depending on which operating system you're on, Windows, Linux, KDE, etc., that might change based on those standards. So the Q form layout is a really convenient and quick way to create a form and lay out your controls appropriately. And of course, that's all just an introduction to a couple of the different form layout options that you have when working with PyQt. As always, check out the documentation. From the main Widgets and Layouts page, you can simply select Layouts and select this link here, and that's going to bring you to a general page of all the different layouts that you have available to you in Qt. As I scroll down here, you can see all the different things that they've got. A lot of them we didn't even cover in this nugget, of course, but feel free to explore and find out the layout that's going to work best for you. That concludes this nugget on working with layouts in the Python Qt user interface library. These layouts should help you get your controls, your widgets, organized on screen in a meaningful and useful way for your users with a minimal amount of coding and rework necessary. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.